So welcome. This is Pay Attention, interviews about truth in troubling times. And today I'm here with Elizabeth Voss, who is an independent journalist who writes for Consortium News and was one of the founders of Disobedient Media. She's covered the Jeffrey Epstein and Gillian Maxwell case, and that is what I'll be talking with her about today. I believe that the story of this case is very important right now, even in the midst of the pandemic and the economic shutdown and the social uprising that's going on all over the place that most of us are preoccupied with. And so I'm really happy to be talking to Elizabeth. I think she's done a terrific job in following this case, and I have listened to her interview with Whitney Webb, and I have followed her work in Consortium News. And so I'm looking forward to just diving into the bigger story and sort of searching out the details as they're sort of tendrils that go out from a root. Welcome, Elizabeth. Very nice to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Actually, before we get to our first question, I wondered if you would tell us just for a moment about Consortium News. I realize I hadn't sort of warned you about this, but I am a fan, and I think many of my listeners would not necessarily know what Consortium News is. So could you just tell us a bit about what it is?
Sure. Consortium News was founded in 1995 by Robert Parry, who was a groundbreaking and well-respected journalist especially who broke the story of Iran-Contra essentially in the late 1980s. And he was censored, so he basically said, all right, well, I'll create my own outlet. He did, and as I said, it's the oldest. It's been going on for 25 years. It's been around. It's older than The Intercept and all the others you might think of that are just online outlets. It has a range of incredible writers, and I'm always humbled to have my work included on the website. It's really an honor. So,
and what I like about it especially is that I believe that it is not connected to any particular political view and does a great job investigating the truth without the sort of political lens over the truth. And that's why I've appreciated it so much. So along those lines, I wonder if you could tell the listeners first about why you find this case to be important and why we should pay attention to it, even in the midst of this pandemic and the other things that are going on.
Well, I think this is a really important case because it does illuminate the corruption of the power structure in the West, not limited to the United States, but I mean, obviously you've got tendrils going over to the UK, you've got connections to Israel. There are a lot of different things going on with this story that really demonstrate to us not only how corrupt those power structures are, but also the complicity of the prosecutorial authorities, to an extent, the complicity of media. And I think, one of the other aspects of it is that it's the tip of the iceberg of a lot of other historical child trafficking rings and whatnot, where there's a very long historical trend of that. This case is very much like, in my opinion, it's a parallel to the type of social unrest we're seeing that is also seeking to address longstanding historical abuses that have not really been heard out enough. And so I think that this story goes along with that effort in a different way. And I think that it's also important because the public for far too long has not had the truth about lots of different aspects of corruption. And this is one area where maybe we're seeing a tiny glimpse into that.
And can you tell us why we have been so sort of unable to see the truth about something that's been in the midst? I mean, we can go into the depth of the history of this, but it's been in our midst for quite a while. And yet, as you said, it's not pursued on a prosecutorial level, on a journalistic level, and then even in terms of the sort of investigative bodies that have been called upon, the FBI and CIA, to actually look into this case, especially from the victim's point of view. There just hasn't been the kind of response that I guess I would have expected for something as serious as these allegations are. So how do you even begin to look at the sort of cover-up side of this?
Well, I think the absence of interest, the absence of prosecution is evidence of itself in terms of just how protected somebody like Epstein or Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell have been. I think that, you see that in even in the most recent documentaries and series that have covered Epstein, whether it's Netflix's series or Investigation Discovery special. You see that although they will discuss some of the more lurid details of the case, and they will admirably give victims and survivors of Epstein's abuse the time and the platform to speak about their stories, they do not cover the intelligence aspects of the story. There are really key elements that they leave out. They even go so far as to really highlight Alex Acosta's role in the sweetheart deal for Epstein. And they'll even have commentators in their series ask the question, well, why did he do this? But they glaringly omit Alex Acosta's statements that he backed off of Epstein because he belonged to intelligence. So I think that, you see that aspect of lies by omission in the media, even to this day, not just, in the years leading up to the most recent events.
I think highlighting that what Acosta said, that he backed off because of Epstein's connection to intelligence, is sort of the first door that opens in trying to see what is this about. Because when I came into the sort of knowledge about the Epstein case, I thought of it as a child sexual abuse case or a child trafficking case. And then I realized it was a different kind of case altogether. So in actually seeing the reluctance for the prosecutorial side of the government to pursue Epstein, you begin to see what's behind it. And I wondered, in terms of your own experience as a journalist, I don't know much about your history as a journalist, and I thought I'd ask you a little bit about that, so that before we step deeply into the case itself, if you could give us your background, and then also in that background, have you met with another case that's like this one? I mean, is there anything that is similar from your past?
Sure, absolutely. So I was inspired to begin writing in 2016 when we saw the media spectacularly fail in its reporting on the 2016 election, and not only that, but following Hillary Clinton's loss to Donald Trump, we saw the media immediately jump on this Russiagate narrative. So basically, in 2017, I co-founded a website named Disobedient Media with some friends, and we all were basically shocked. I mean, none of us had journalistic backgrounds. I have a bachelor's in English literature. My friends who co-founded the site were, people who had graduated with law degrees. But we all saw that anybody who had any sense of critical thinking and could be in any way, basically literate, could do a better job than the media was doing. So we decided to cover stories that were either being misrepresented, like Russiagate, in the media, or were being suppressed and omitted entirely. So we covered stories about WikiLeaks, we covered obviously Russiagate, we covered some geopolitical subjects, and we covered a number of different human trafficking cases. And so through the process of that, I then got very interested in the persecution of Julian Assange and the smearing of WikiLeaks. That got me into some activism around that, which I'm still a part of. And so that's kind of a long and short of my history. In 2019, I began co-hosting a webcast with Consortium News called CNLive with Joe Lauria, and that's been going on for just over a year now. We try to cover lots of different subjects. I mean, just whether it's WikiLeaks or Assange, lots of different geopolitical issues, we cover them. But I think my interest in the Epstein case does come from having covered multiple different human trafficking stories, and specifically seeing this trend where you have intelligence ties to separate rings, and or you have rings that are clearly a network of abuse that are kind of suppressed in the media and represented, falsely represented as one lone nut job. And that's one of the other things you see in the Epstein case, and even in these most recent Netflix and Investigation Discovery documentaries, they sort of present Epstein as somebody who just, is this really, man, he's just an evil genius. And now that he's gone, wow, I guess we won't get much justice, but thank God that's over. Where really, that was a larger network of people, as journalists like Whitney Webb have discussed. And similarly, in cases like Dutroux in Belgium in the late 1980s, you had
Yes.
Marc Dutroux portrayed as someone who had murdered these little girls on his own, when all of the evidence suggested that he was part of a larger group. So I think, somebody like Whitney Webb has a much greater encyclopedic level knowledge of the details of the Epstein case, but what I can bring and what I've looked at, the way that I look at the Epstein case is through that lens of context and the historical background, where you have multiple different rings like this in different areas of the world, whether it's in the UK, Europe, or the United States.
Yes, and I think the reason also that this case is interesting to me is that it seems to have this same flavor that I've found in some of the reporting about, everything from JFK's assassination to 9/11, and then on the way to the pandemic, and of course Russiagate, the election. All of these, the ways that the stories are reported don't actually make sense if you even think a little bit about what you actually know or what you actually see. In the case of Russiagate, I mean, it just didn't make sense to me that the media were suddenly only interested in this one theme that seemed so thinly sort of, I don't know, meaningful, and so it right away I started getting suspicious about why I was being sort of talked into a particular story. And it seems to be the same thing with particularly the idea that Epstein is, as you said, some sort of evil genius, and makes lots of money and does all of these terrible things, but oh well, he's over now. And I did watch I watched Filthy Rich and Who Killed Jeffrey Epstein. And while I was impressed with a certain amount of the interview footage, there was also simply a lot that was left hanging, and even left hanging in a provocative way, like the Acosta thing. So, what do you make of the fact that this is not covered journalistically and is rarely sort of in any mainstream media? I saw a little bit about Gillian Maxwell's arrest, or sorry, the records being opened this morning, but very little. So what is it? Is it the cooperation of mainstream journalism with the cover-up, or is it is the problem that people are afraid of the various groups that the material is connected to? Do you have a sense yourself about why it's not better covered by mainstream journalism?
Well, I think it's something that you can also see in the coverage of issues when it comes to war. You have very biased coverage on those types of subjects as well. And I think the reason is kind of similar. I don't think that there is some sort of grand conspiracy, but I do think there's this kind of tendency with journalists who are in establishment media outlets to not want to cover unfavorably people that they have connections with. And there's kind of a natural, organic old boys club that happens where, if you want to survive in the media, you're going to have contacts, and if not directly with you, the people that you're working for are going to have contacts with people who are very influential. I mean, we had that, the one leaked clip a little while, I think last year, where a journalist was basically on a hot mic on air talking about how they wouldn't cover the Epstein issue because they didn't want to lose contact with the royal family. So I think that there's a lot of just kind of natural hesitance to expose those who are rich and powerful because you don't want to lose those kind of that social currency. But I also think it is part of the fact that media is run by a small number of conglomerate corporate sources now. And, unfortunately, a lot of that is also in bed with not just government and intelligence agency kind of interests, but in general, it is in bed with intelligence interests, which also then are exposed, especially by the Epstein story, because as we've mentioned, it does have intelligence links. So I think that I'm not trying to argue, and there is no evidence at this time that there is some sort of directive or something like that. I think it's more of a natural, like, well, we don't want to embarrass our boss kind of situation. I do think on the part of some individual journalists, there may be conflict of interest that causes them to either misrepresent or omit things. Whitney Webb's talked about the friendship between Vicky Ward and Gillian Maxwell, and some kind of issues there between her and some of the Epstein victims. So I think there's a mix going on of kind of an organic live omission type cover up and some intentional misrepresentation.
Because it does seem that Whitney Webb is saying that that intelligence is also heavily involved in the cover-up and also heavily involved in the crimes. And so
Right.
that I don't know then if there's danger to people who would be working against that intelligence, So I simply wondered what your view was, but your view is more that it's a number of things that are sort of conspiring together. There's not one big conspiracy, but a number of, let's say, tendencies to align with either the rich and the powerful, or to perhaps not go against intelligence or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that
I think,
what your
yes,
view would be?
I think it's a combination. I think Whitney's right, but and I think there is this natural tendency to basically support the power in place when you're trying to rise in that power structure yourself, and that's true whether you're an intelligence or a journalist. And I think that the reason you can compare it to the coverage of war as well is because there again we see even outlets like the New York Times basically publishing CIA talking points, whether it's on Syria or whether it was on Iraq in the lead up to the 2003 invasion. So that's the parallel I see, is basically mainstream media kind of being press, PR organizations for intelligence interests, which of course they're not going to want to cover the intelligence aspects of a child trafficking ring because that would embarrass the intelligence agencies, obviously. But I think there is definitely that natural tendency to protect power when you're trying to get it yourself.
So I wanted to ask you about the arrest of Gillian Maxwell before we even talk further about Jeffrey Epstein. What do you think of this arrest? And it's fairly recent, I guess the beginning of July. She was arrested supposedly at her house in New Hampshire. I don't think I've seen any video of her or any evidence that she's really anywhere. So how do you look upon that arrest, and what's supposed to be happening as a result of it?
Well, again, it's one of those things that leaves the public open to ask so many questions. And if you do ask those questions, then you are labeled a conspiracy theorist. It's bizarre that there's no mugshot. There's no footage of Ghislaine Maxwell's arrest. There still isn't. To my knowledge, there's still nothing. No images of her in jail or in court or even by video link. We do have some court drawings of her, but that's it. I think that's very obviously it's unusual, and at minimum it does show that that trend of one type of justice for the very wealthy and the very powerful, and one type of justice for the rest of us. I mean, I can't imagine a normal person off the street not having their mugshot published, et cetera, et cetera. So that I think it's fair to question that. I don't have an explanation for it, but it's another bizarre aspect of the case. And I think that it was interesting to see her arrest one day after Judge Preska, in a separate, basically a civil suit
Right.
between one of the Epstein victims and Alan Dershowitz, ordered the destruction of evidence. Then one day later, you have Ghislaine Maxwell arrested. Similarly, last year in 2019, the day before Jeffrey Epstein actually died, you saw in that same civil suit the publication of a lot of names and documents in the case. And former intelligence officer Ari Ben-Benasher, who I interviewed as well, told me that he basically summed up the lawsuit as Jeffrey Epstein's death sentence. So I think, again, you have to look at Ghislaine's arrest sort of in context of all this Gordian knot of other suits, other, documents being published or ordered destroyed. I don't know at this time whether those documents have been destroyed, or we know.
Yes, I was wondering about that too. That's not known. And
not that I can find, no.
And so do you have any speculation about whether Ghislaine Maxwell is cooperating with some intelligence agency, or whether she has been arrested. I mean, it's very different than when we did see Jeffrey Epstein. We did see photographs of him. We saw him in his second arrest. You know, so there was some degree of reality associated with his going to jail and being in court and so on. But with this, there's nothing. So do you have any sort of speculation yourself about whether this is happening or that is happening? You know, is she cooperating with some investigation and that's why she's not being pictured? Or is she getting a good deal, which is what I think Whitney Webb thought was happening?
Absolutely. And I agree with Whitney's analysis. I think that it's very likely that this is basically theater. Really, it's legal theater to make, to establish a public narrative that justice is at least attempting to be done in this case. I think that, as Whitney points out, the indictment of Ghislaine Maxwell does actually describe Maxwell taking part in the abuse of minors, and yet that indictment does not charge her with that. It only charges her with some minor crimes of, you know, taking children across state lines in order to be trafficked, and perjury. So just looking at the charges as Whitney's done, you can see that this is not, it's not, you know, trying to actually get the type of real justice that people would expect that the public might perceive this charge to be. And the fact that the indictment does actually describe her taking part in this abuse, you can see how that would make the public think that she was being charged with abuse of minors. It's really a very intelligent but deceptive type of situation. And I think that whether or not she's in jail, you know, whatever may be going on with that is just more of the same in terms of this being a theatrical process, essentially, rather than a real intent to prosecute on the part of the authorities.
And yet, like so many other things, it's very thinly veiled. So it really doesn't take too much curiosity, or, you know, it certainly doesn't take paranoia to think that there's something going on here. It's not exactly what it seems to be. And so that's why I find it particularly peculiar. If it is theater, it's very bad theater. So, I mean, but I'm not used to sort of understanding what goes on with intelligence. You know, it's not in my usual sort of bandwidth. But if it is theater, and I could see that Whitney thought it was theater, it's very bad theater. So, you know, it seems like it could have been orchestrated much differently. And when you know, the whole sort of Epstein death looked like theater, but better theater. I mean, it looked like it could make sense. And there was evidence both ways about whether it was a suicide or a homicide. But this is very strange because we don't see anything, and the charges don't fit with the evidence, and nothing seems to have happened. So I really don't know what it means, and apparently you don't either, that she was arrested.
Well, I think that, again, I think what it means, I agree with Whitney, that it is an attempt to make it look like justice is being pursued. Because after Epstein's death, and this was even pointed out in some of those recent documentaries, the victims of Epstein really had no justice and no recourse, because with Epstein's death, all of the criminal case against him died. There's no way to, and even if that criminal case may not have been successful in the end, because of the corruption in the legal process, there would have been the potential for very damning evidence to be aired during that process. So that process of being able to publicly air this evidence was ended. And I think that the prosecution of Ghislaine Maxwell is really to give the sense that, well, maybe this time there will be justice. And I doubt that there will be.
And do you think that the victims will continue to pursue their case? I mean, of course, if the evidence did have to be destroyed, then there's a big loss for them. But that's not even clear whether that happened. It sounded at the end of Filthy Rich, it sounded as though the victims were going to continue. And that was actually the sort of motor behind his second arrest, Epstein's second arrest, and the possibility for bringing any of this out into the public seemed to be connected more to the victims than to any, government prosecutorial force or to intelligence.
Absolutely.
So will the victims keep going, do you think? Can they?
I hope that they will. It seems that they will, from what I'm seeing, that they are continuing to seek justice. I know that Maria Farmer specifically has been very outspoken in recent months. I think that those efforts may or may not be successful in just in terms of an actual end result. I hope that more evidence will come from these various suits. I mean, because you've got a real collection of different lawsuits back and forth just between Virginia Roberts and Gillian Maxwell, between Virginia Roberts, Giuffre, and Alan Dershowitz. And then you have other victims who have tried to serve Ghislaine Maxwell with suits, but while Ghislaine was, AWOL, when she was missing, she was unable to be served. And I've looked into it, I cannot find whether or not she has now been served by additional victims, but that's something that was reported to be, what they were trying to do, is to serve her with more lawsuits. So there's no telling what type of evidence could come from those suits if they were to proceed.
And does anyone know where she is actually?
Well, she's reportedly in New York in a jail with a very bad reputation, which obviously Whitney, suggested might be a setup for something similar in terms of what happened to Jeffrey Epstein. But as you said, there's no photographic evidence that she's really there. So who knows? I mean, that's where she's supposed to be, but there's no telling.
I see. So I'm going to just now look back over some of the reporting, in looking back over some of the history of the Epstein case. What I looked at particularly was the site called Lost Messiah, which I guess is an attempt to trace and then maybe repair crimes that were committed by Jewish people. Is that the correct way of saying that? I mean, I looked at the site called Lost Messiah, and I thought it said something like it was an effort to sort of bring to truth various crimes that have been committed by Jewish people. I don't know, but
I've never actually been on that website, but I mean, I'm happy to talk about the information.
Yeah, the information is there, and that's where I found the information that I was looking for, which was I was looking after listening to your reporting, and I was looking then back over the history, because I think that the history of this case goes back a long distance, and I'm not going to go back as far as Whitney did, but I simply wanted to quote a little bit from what I found on the site. So it said that an article that was published in 1992 in the UK's Mail on Sunday describes rumors that linked Epstein to the CIA and to Mossad, and claimed that he had worked as a corporate spy hired by big businesses to uncover money that had been embezzled. In addition, so this is going back to 92, an article published then in 2000 in London's Sunday Times stated that nobody knows whether Epstein is a concert pianist, a property developer, a CIA agent, a math teacher, or a member of Mossad. And these kinds of various rumors and stories about Epstein go back apparently particularly in the UK press. And there was, I know that I listened to your interview linking him to Israeli intelligence and not to Mossad, and so I'd like to hear about those distinctions. But the CIA link and the Mossad link seem to have been detailed through a number of different media, and then corroborated at different times. And also there was the connection of his being a self-described financial bounty hunter who hunted down embezzled funds and hid stolen money for powerful people in governments. So that side of his background, in terms of, was he working for Mossad? Was he working for the CIA? Was he tracking down various kinds of financial situations for corporations? I don't know about the concert pianist. I'd never heard that that description before. But there are these different rumors, and they're particularly in the British press. And then, of course, he's connected to the royal family, as most people know, through Andrew, but also, you know, having been invited to at least one party at the Queen's estate somewhere, and I guess was there with Ghislaine Maxwell. So could you kind of trace back at least to the early 90s, the history of Epstein, Epstein-Maxwell, and then how this interacts with the royal family, as well as potentially the CIA and Israeli intelligence?
Sure. Now, this is the part where Whitney is the absolute authority on these details. So I hope that you reach out to her and also talk to her about this. And I don't want to try to even remotely kind of, you know, imitate the research that she's done on the history of this specific case. But I will say that Ari Ben Menashe, who I mentioned before, intelligence officer for the Israeli military intelligence, and in that capacity, he says that he worked with Robert Maxwell, media tycoon, who's Ghislaine Maxwell's father, who died in 1991 in a mysterious yacht accident. Robert Maxwell was reported to be working with, obviously, Israeli intelligence, sometimes with UK intelligence, and potentially other agencies, potentially even with Russian intelligence. So you have that background with Ghislaine's father, and also Ari Ben Menashe's work with Robert Maxwell. And in that capacity, Menashe says that he met Ghislaine and Epstein, and that Ghislaine and Epstein were working as sort of management for, or almost chumps for Israeli military intelligence with this, in terms of this child trafficking exploitation, in order to get blackmail on important figures. Menashe says he did not obviously work and was not a part of that operation, but that he was aware of it. And that
so let me just pause you here for a second so we can draw that out, just so people can understand what that means.
Right.
And so can you say, you know, blackmail operation, using child trafficking, or you know, I guess sexual, I don't even know if sexual slavery comes into it, or simply sexual arrangements, but being used for blackmail principally? Or can you just sketch that out a little bit?
So basically, and what Menashe told me, and also has said to other sources, and this particular sentiment was also published in a book late last year. He says, you know, it's not illegal to sleep around, to cheat on your wife, and in previous decades that type of information could blackmail you a little bit. It could be a source of embarrassment, but obviously, you know, having sex with underage you know, girls or boys is a crime. And so that is a very powerful form of blackmail, and it's very useful for intelligence agencies. And that's why it would be so lucrative for somebody like Epstein and Ghislaine to be procuring girls and setting situations up with these powerful figures like Prince Andrew, but others as well, where they're photographed in vulnerable situations. We know that the mansion that Leslie Wexner basically gifted Epstein in New York was heavily set up with surveillance equipment, as was his island, as was every other residence that we know about. So that's sort of a sketch. Do you want me to expand?
Well, I guess did you say chump? Did you say chump?
Yeah.
And so what do you mean by chump?
Well, when that was Ari's word. So when he was describing to me, you know, what Epstein and Ghislaine were doing, he kind of characterized them as, well, not intelligent or skilled enough to really do anything else. You know what I mean? It was kind of like, well, you know, this is the only thing they're useful for. That was the sense that I got. And I think that also goes in support and validation of Whitney's sense that Epstein was really a middle management guy. He wasn't this like evil genius architect that the media likes to portray him as. And that really there were much more powerful figures that were not publicly, you know, in the media as much, Leslie Wexner being one of them. But there are others that you know, probably have not been named.
Haven't been exposed yet.
Yeah, right.
And along those lines, I think I heard Whitney say, and I wonder what you think of this, that Galine was somebody who could, I guess, pilot a submarine, drive a helicopter, speak 5 languages, which makes it look like she's a spy. I mean, in my mind, at least, like, why would she's a socialite, or she's the daughter of a powerful publisher, why would she be trained in these kinds of activities if she weren't herself in some sort of spy role? Is that also part of the narrative that that Ben Menashe is? That I did hear the interview, but I don't know his name.
Yeah, Ari Ben Menashe. Yes,
Ari Ben Menashe. Does he also have the narrative that Ghislaine herself might have been working somehow for intelligence?
Yes.
In a much higher role than Epstein?
Well, that's an interesting question that I hope, that should be put to him. But my sense from speaking with him was that, yes, that Ghislaine was working, along with her father with Epstein, but also that the reason, and the reason he gave for Epstein really being brought in by Robert Maxwell was it sort of because of, or tangentially, in tandem with the fact that he was sort of this romantic figure for Galine, and it was sort of like a family business move and that type of thing. So you have that. And then I will add, I want to go back for a moment because you mentioned in reading from the source that you had connections between Epstein and Mossad. And I'd like to add that although Ari Ben Menashe, he worked with him worked with Robert Maxwell and met Epstein through Israeli military intelligence, which is a separate entity from Mossad, obviously. There are a number of other relatively credible sources that would link Epstein to Mossad. So I think that I wouldn't discount the idea that Epstein could also have had those contacts or been working with Mossad. Ben Menashe says that Robert Maxwell was attempting to blackmail Mossad at one point. So there's a whole lot of kind of contradictory information. And I would encourage your viewers to kind of go look at all of that and decide for themselves, because there is no, we're not going to get a stamp from Mossad, right, or saying, yes, well, actually, yes, he did work for us and over there, but then, that happened. So it's not going to happen, but we do have information suggesting that may also be the case. So.
Yes. And so, possibly Epstein truly was a romantic interest of Ghislaine Maxwell, and so came on in a much sort of smaller role than the role she was in, and was brought on partly by her father because of her interest in, I guess, in him personally, in Jeffrey Epstein personally. And then the idea that she procured, somebody said thousands of girls, is that right? Thousands?
That wouldn't be surprising. I don't know that there are any official numbers or or at least that have been published, but thousands would not surprise me at all. And one of the important things that Whitney pointed out was that essentially, while the media is presenting Ghislaine as this gal pal madam, just, procuring women just to satisfy her, lover's, lust or whatever, what Whitney points out very perceptively is that what he was really doing was grooming and basically, evaluating these girls for use in that larger trafficking and blackmail operation. So this wasn't just for his, sick pedophiliac enjoyment. It was something where it had a purpose that was intelligence related, which again, that's the thing that you're not going to hear in the media. So
right, and obviously Ghislaine participated in that, and so she was involved with them sexually, but in the grooming part of it too. And all of it towards some sort of larger framework for blackmail. But I guess blackmail at a level that, I know now that there are all sorts of blackmail opportunities that are connected to the technology we have now that weren't around in the 90s. But the way that that mansion was outfitted with video was practically, I guess, pretty much every corner, every bathroom, every bedroom, and a bank of video recorders. And so it was set up to, it seems like, entrap people or catch people. And then those, I assume, would be the rich and the powerful that then the intelligence agencies might want to do business with in terms of getting favors carried out and so on and so forth. And, in everything that I've seen about this, there's a sort of distinct absence of the Russians. The Russians being almost always the focus of so many narratives in the media. And it seems like instead, so far I have heard of no Russians. It's Americans, it's British. I don't know if there are, I guess, are there others? Are there Saudis or any others involved that we know about that are being?
In this particular case, the only Russian connection I'm aware of is through Robert Maxwell, who may have been at some time working with the KGB or had some interaction with them. I have not read or heard about any connection with the Russians in terms of Epstein and Ghislaine. However, I would like to add that in the 1970s and 1980s, there was an East Coast trafficking network that was more focused around boys on the East Coast of the United States. And Disobedient Media a few years ago was able to FOIA documents that were basically a public hearing about child pornography that just so and child trafficking that just so happened to mention that Israeli and Russian intelligence were interested in collecting that material, similarly blackmail material, that then they would get information on the clientele of these child prostitution rackets in order to blackmail them and interface with them. So there is I don't think I would imagine that any intelligence agency you can list would probably have at some point had an interest in this type of blackmail material because it's valuable and useful to them.
Right, and I think it might have been last summer that I read a large expose that was in the New York Times on child pornography, and it was actually horrifying. I mean, that there had been this huge increase in child trafficking and child pornography, and that the sort of scope of it is beyond, I think, most people's imagination. And I guess there are sort of a number of different ways in which this type of crime is used. So it can be used as blackmail, and it can be used for making money, and it can be used for all sorts of things. And I guess I heard somebody say that even the young women that worked for Epstein in his island mansion, many of them were women who hadn't come there freely. Even if they weren't being sexually abused, they might have been enslaved in some way to work there. Could you tell us a little bit about what was, I mean, I know I'm skipping around here, but because I thought of this side of it, about the mansion in the Caribbean and what has happened to it. And I realized there that there's the possibility also of some sort of prosecution through the governor of the island, or I believe. So,
I think I believe Galine is currently being that there is an attempt to kind of prosecute Galine from I think it's the Attorney General of the U.S. Virgin Islands wants to go after her, and I believe because of basically tax issues and basically having taken advantage of the financial situation in that area. So I think that that's yet another complicated legal aspect of the case. But I think that in terms of just in general, that use of blackmail material or the pornography for various different purposes, when you look at there are historical trafficking operations, it's used to influence and control many people from from the Epstein ring back down to the Kincora boys home in the 1980s in Belfast in Northern Ireland. That was monitored allegedly by UK intelligence, and it was part of that conflict between England and Ireland during that time period. So you can have, my point in bringing that up is that you can have very localized intelligence interests, and then in something like the Epstein issue, you can have international interests being served. So it serves a lot of purposes, even just in terms of the political and intelligence use of it. Now, in terms of the island itself, I have heard Whitney discuss the fact that victims of the sexual survivors of Epstein's abuse did talk about that there were people working in his premises that did not come there freely, that had in some way been basically illegally brought there. And so I think that again, it shows the degree to which that elite, I don't even like using the word elite, but that oligarchic class will just unashamedly use people and objectify them to the nth degree, and with very, very little repercussion, very little recourse, and very little prosecution for it.
And the reason why there's not more outrage about that, you think, is simply that there are arrangements among wealthy people and among the media and so on not to bring this into a public view. And so again and again, apparently, there's a sort of interface between the crimes really gets sort of erased or misunderstood, like the crimes around child pornography or around procuring and then trafficking young girls, that somehow doesn't get understood as being part of intelligence and part of the manipulation of governments in order to get certain outcomes that are, let's say, desirable by the oligarchs or the elite, if you want to call them that. So it seems like this has been going on for a long time, and yet this case is a very big one, and one in which there could be sort of many many participants who are exposed, and also perhaps many child trafficking rings that would be stopped, but none of that is really happening.
Exactly. And I think returning to the people who are working on the island and in other premises who could essentially be characterized as indentured servants, or being trafficked in a sense of slavery even, that not being covered by the media is yet another example of the type of thing that either they deem to be not important, or that that is just, I don't want to say covered up, but basically, if this had happened in a different context, I think we would hear nothing but headlines about it for months. But in this type of situation, it's something that instead of being lied about is just omitted, or just not focused on as much.
When you say a different context, what were you thinking?
Well, I was thinking more, if you have something like, let's say, I don't know, that if somebody the media dislikes, like let's say that CNN gets hold of information that Donald Trump has indentured servants at Mar-a-Lago or something.
Right.
I think that would definitely be in the news constantly 24/7 for about a month. We would hear that, or it would be very much emphasized. Whereas I guess when interests are potentially going to be exposed that the media is friendly with, then maybe that isn't discussed as much. And I think basically seeing what the types of issues and stories the media does focus on, as well as those that they don't. It's both. It's not just the ones that they present or present inaccurately. It's the ones that they really do omit that gives you some sort of sense of who the media serves, and
yes, and who's controlling the media. Yeah,
right.
So just because you mentioned Donald Trump's name, so can you talk with us about how the Clintons intersect with all of this, the Clinton Foundation, the Clintons themselves, and then we'll go to Alan Dershowitz, but then also the Queen and Prince Andrew.
Quite a list. So, yeah.
Yes. It's these are the people whose names do come up very often and seem to have escaped real scrutiny on the part of the media.
Yeah, and other people, Kevin Spacey, Naomi Campbell. There are lots of really influential and famous figures who are involved in this. I think it's interesting to me to note that Epstein basically claimed to have helped found, or had part of the idea that led to, I believe it was either the Clinton Global Initiative or the Clinton Foundation itself. As Whitney Webb points out, Galine was involved with the Clinton Global Initiative. So there was this philanthropic kind of crossover between the Clintons and Epstein. The activities of the Clinton Foundation is a subject for itself and could take up an entire interview. And you have basically
tell us what you can right now about it.
Yeah, so there are some basically that it seemed to be it appears to be basically a foundation that was used for some pay for play type, quid pro quo payments from various interests to the Clintons. Much of that money was not did not go to the areas it was supposed to. In Haiti, there have been massive protests where the Clinton Foundation went in after the 2010 earthquake, and I believe millions of dollars were raised for Haiti that the Haitians never saw. And so there are big protests there against the Clintons.
And so, didn't George Bush and Bill Clinton go together to Haiti?
They did.
Holding hands, and yes, and then nothing really got done.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there are a number of different examples of that. But so there's the involvement on the philanthropic front. There's obviously Bill Clinton's many flights on the Lolita Express that Epstein ran, I believe, and you have the same thing with these other figures, Kevin Spacey, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the involvement that goes back to at least the early 2000s. Whitney Webb would be a better, font of information on exactly, the details of that. But we do know that Clinton was heavily involved, and also that Trump, counted Epstein amongst his friends, at least at one time. We had the recent bizarre statement by Trump that he wishes Ghislaine Maxwell well, that he wishes her the best. That was odd.
I wondered about that when that happened. I wondered if that was code for something.
I have no idea.
It was a very weird statement. It seemed unnecessary to make. And then also, I guess that Trump's real estate holdings in New York intersected somehow with Epstein's real estate holdings. And it seems as though Trump was more involved with him on the real estate side than the trafficking side or whatever, or
right.
The girls side or that.
And it's really sad when you have to compare the current president to a past president and how many trips they had on the plane or whatever. I don't know that Donald Trump was recorded on that plane. But regardless, I think, it is again telling when you have, you can tell kind of where people's political agenda is depending on which person or which set of people they emphasize being involved with Jeffrey Epstein. But unfortunately, it's pretty much everyone in that plutocratic class had some level of connection or involvement. But Bill Clinton and the Queen, Prince Andrew, all of that are definitely significant figures. I don't know. I think that from what Ari Ben-Menashe said, that Prince Andrew was a major conduit to some of these figures. And I'm not saying that the Queen was directly, had any knowledge of.
Do you mean a major conduit for the blackmailing of various government figures or powerful figures? That's what he would be, where Galine might have been bringing the girls in, he was bringing in the political figures, would be the idea.
Right. I think Ghislaine was also bringing in major figures, but I do think that Prince Andrew would have been another huge access point to these powerful figures. Yes. And whether he was, knowledgeably procuring these figures to have them be blackmailed, or whether it was more, again, like kind of this organic, like, well, let's party with my friend over here. I'm not privy to information that would go one way or the other on that. We obviously saw Prince Andrew's horrendous interview, late last, which I mean, it was almost like a comedy sketch. But basically, I think that I got the sense that maybe he was, again, if Galine and Epstein were middle management sort of chumps for this operation, then I mean, Prince Andrew, I would imagine, was even less,
more of a chump.
Right, exactly. So I don't know. But I definitely think that he played a major role in procuring people of influence for these situations in these very heavily surveilled locations.
And then what about Alan Dershowitz? I mean, Alan Dershowitz is a sort of figure who has played so many different roles in the media, since OJ's trial. And I don't even know how to conceptualize who Alan Dershowitz is anymore, but that he enters into this particular scandal in such a big way is confusing to me. Can you say something more about it's in Filthy Rich. He figures, he's interviewed in Filthy Rich too, but so just what you know about Alan Dershowitz.
Right. I think Alan Dershowitz is another fascinating figure, as is Leslie Wexner. Dershowitz at some point represented Epstein, I believe, and helped had some part in crafting that non-prosecution agreement in
Oh, that's right.
2007.
Yes.
I think he also he's I believe published op-eds arguing for the lowering of the age of consent. He claims that he never slept with any of the girls associated with Epstein, and that he quote, kept his underwear on during these massages. But nonetheless, Virginia Roberts Giuffre does allege that she was trafficked to Dershowitz, and I think that my guess would be that somebody like Dershowitz, I think that the allegations against him are credible, is the way I would say it. And I think that he's been somebody who has, although he has very staunchly defended himself against these allegations, I get the sense from his actions that he's basically using some lawfare against especially Virginia Roberts. That they've had different lawsuits back and forth against each other in terms of defamation, and that those cases, one of them is where we get the order to destroy documents from Judge Preska. That's we get that's the Dershowitz lawsuit situation is also where we get the recent publication of the unsealing of some documents as well. Dershowitz claims that he's trying to clear his name by publishing this information. For example, he wants a list of Epstein clients, or his little black book. He wants that to be published so that he alleges he can show that his name was not on it. But that does not negate in any way the allegations of people like Virginia Roberts Giuffre. So,
but it also puts him in an interesting spot because he wants those published, and so where does that put him vis-a-vis? I mean, of course, I wouldn't know who's in the black book, but there must be some people who are not and some people who are from his knowledge of it. Those would be, I guess, the black book is supposed to be the regulars at the mansion or the regulars on the island or something like that.
Yes.
And I think in Filthy Rich, you see Woody Allen, you see some other people leaving the mansion. I can't really remember all of the people, but they are again kind of well-known celebrities, and when you see that bank of video recorders, you can't imagine that anyone would have escaped if they did anything that was a little off. So I don't know. Do you think everybody was really pretty unaware of the video cameras?
That's like an interesting question, whether they knew or not. I have no idea whether they would have been aware initially. Maybe they were after. Maybe at some point there was a conversation where, hey, we have video of you doing X, Y, Z, and then at that point they would become aware. I don't know that there's been any exposure of that type of intricate detail. I would imagine, though, that they would not know initially, at least, that there was surveillance. Otherwise, it would kind of go against the ability to collect blackmail on them. I think with Dershowitz, it's interesting too, because one way you can look at his efforts to unseal these documents, and these various kind of lawfare efforts he goes to in these defamation suits back and forth, is that perhaps it's not so much that he thinks that there is evidence that would clear him, but simply saying there is, and while he knows that his actual efforts will be unsuccessful, is an attempt to defend his character that way. So he can say bluster and kind of bluff and say, well, this is going to clear my name, but it can't be revealed. You know what I'm saying? So
yes, I see.
That's an interesting point. But as far as the surveillance of these, very influential and famous people, whether it's Woody Allen or whatever, I think aside from just the surveillance aspect, I think it's interesting to note that there are, in some cases, not all, allegations against these figures as well that are separate to Epstein that involve sexual abuse, whether you're talking about Woody Allen or whether you're talking about Kevin Spacey.
Right.
Specifically had a number of male people come forward who allege that he abused them when they were minors. And so, so there are a lot of different people who happen to be both very famous and accused of sexual abuses who were regulars at this mansion. And I do know there was footage of Prince Andrew in the New York mansion, waving goodbye to some girls who were seen exiting the building with Epstein, and Epstein and Andrew kind of going back and forth in and out of the door a little bit. So
you can also imagine, I mean, just thinking out loud here, that if there could be a sort of a weaving in of people recognizing that there is footage of them and then making deals to get other people involved. and always with perhaps the idea that all this is going to be protected because it's a part of intelligence and that they're sort of above the law in that way. And it seems to me that Epstein must have felt that way. He must have felt like no matter what he did, he was going to be protected by the FBI or the CIA because he's really working for them. Right. And so then he can bring people in, he can weave them into this kind of web where they can bring others. And even if they know they are being surveilled, they're not worried about it because they're actually in the inner circle of the power. So they're always going to be protected. And then actually nobody counted on the victims actually doing anything. I mean, I think once Epstein was eliminated, well, I mean, that it was a result of the victims that he was actually in jail in New York, because the very first arrest looked like he was going to be able to roll with that, being a part of the intelligence. So, I mean, I can see how this whole scheme may have looked as though it was pretty well protected. And there must have been, and maybe still are, many schemes like it. Because if you are sort of at the center of the power sort of sphere, and then you've got intelligence on your side, no matter what you do, if you're working for intelligence, you can cycle it through, I guess. That's the way it looks to me. I mean, just in talking about it, because at some point, the people that were coming regularly to the mansion or to the island must have known about the videos.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I think if not at first, definitely along the line. And I think that's a really feasible, framework with which to view it. I think it's almost the sense I get hearing you speak about it is of almost a sexual Ponzi scheme. And I think that might be an accurate way of understanding it. And I think that may not be unique, but it is the one that is the most recent that we have a good picture of. And maybe that's exactly what people were doing is, okay, I've got intelligence on me, so I'm going to then bring in someone else and to keep myself protected by doing so. Right.
Yes, that's a very good way of thinking of it. And, yes, I mean, there probably are other schemes like this, but this is a big one, and it's current, and it's really being obscured. And it seems as though only the victims are the ones who are sort of scratching at the door to bring it out, where there should be a lot of outrage on the part of ordinary people about the children involved, also from the point of view of feminists about the abuse of so many young girls. And, I just don't hear it. I don't hear people coming out and saying, we have to get to the bottom of this. This was sort of extraordinarily harmful, horrific, however you want to put it, to have thousands of primarily girls. I know there might have been boys, but it was really principally girls, and the victims that we hear from are all female. And that there's no outrage about it is, very strange. It's just very strange. And I wonder if you can put your thoughts about sort of where this case is now, and the fact that Ghislaine has been arrested, and there is some sort of conversation about more being revealed. Where can you put that into the kind of mix of everything, like here we are with a pandemic and going on and on about wearing masks, even though there really isn't any science behind the mask wearing, and we go on and on about social distancing when there perhaps is herd immunity. And there seem to be a number of things that we're going on and on about in media that aren't as somehow, let's say, clearly important as this level of criminality that's involved in this case. And so what's your view about what's sort of happening in the present moment?
Well, I think the crux of what you're asking is really about the role of the media in my mind, because it's the media that decides whether to focus on the feminist concerns this case brings up, the horror of child trafficking, how prevalent it is, versus basically kind of wedge issues that you can argue as to how valid the issue is in itself, much less which side of it is correct. I think that is a really, it's an important observation that this case allows. You really see the priorities of the media in this case in the way that they don't cover it, especially. It's similar. I see the Epstein case as as almost a direct inversion, the flip side of the coin of the situation with a publisher like WikiLeaks and a figure like Julian Assange. If you look at Epstein and Galine, they are both protected. They are both not prosecuted to the full extent of the law for what they, even according to the authorities, are alleged to have done. So you get that sense over and over again. Well, who's protecting them? Well, it seems to be intelligence linked or intelligence tied. The media is not covering it well enough. So it's this kind of nest, or in which they just have been able to, develop this ring basically unchallenged for a very, very long time.
Right.
In contrast, you have WikiLeaks doing good journalism, scientific journalism, publishing primary source material that has, damaged the reputation of intelligence interests and intelligence agencies, that has really embarrassed them on a lot of fronts, that's exposed evidence of US war crimes. So where Epstein was kind of serving intelligence interests, somebody like Julian Assange has gone against them in an evidence-based way, has been the entire opposite of the media in terms of the Epstein and protecting intelligence interests. And so what you see then is you have Julian Assange defamed in the media, a constant attempt to portray him falsely as a rapist. You have WikiLeaks itself as an organization attacked. We have documents from the US and authorities basically talking about how to break down trust in the public towards WikiLeaks. And you have him right now in the UK's version of Guantanamo Bay in Belmarsh prison, awaiting potential extradition to the United States for charges of espionage for being a journalist. I think that, so basically, again, it's the complete opposite of what we saw in the Epstein case. And I think that actually viewing them together is interesting because it exposes the media for not doing its job, and the authorities and the kind of corrupt nature of the power structures we have now in the supposedly democratic, liberal Western world.
Right, and especially intelligence, like as you pointed out, it's this role in relation to intelligence, who gets protected, who gets exposed. It's as though there's a control of the whole narrative that has to do with the relationship to intelligence. It seems as though there's some kind of complicity between the media and the intelligence that won't allow, intelligence agencies, that won't allow the truth to come forth on many issues that are, not only extremely important for democracy, but just extremely important for something like morality or the truth, or something that one could think of as an underlying structure in a civilization. And I see that very much in relation to the Assange case as well. I'm happy you brought it in because that's really not what we were talking about, but it aligns really well when you think of this kind of inverted relationship to what was happening with US intelligence. So I think that I hope that people will pay closer attention, but I'm not sure they will, to what's going on with this case. And I wonder if, you can say anything about how you look at Ghislaine's kind of placement. Well, there's Ghislaine, but also her sisters, because I think they're sort of in interesting positions too, vis-a-vis technology and some other aspects of sort of the Western elite or oligarchy. So if you would just talk about where you think that, what might be going on with Gillian Maxwell. Is it a this or is it a that? And what's going on with Christine, I think, and Isabel, her sisters, and where are they placed at this moment in this sort of, puzzle that we're looking at in terms of the Epstein case?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have to defer again to Whitney Webb. She's done a lot of fantastic reporting on Ghislaine Maxwell's sisters and their role in various scandals. I think some relating to the Promise scandal, and that Robert Maxwell also had a lot to do with. So I think Ghislaine is in a very interesting position. I cannot imagine that she wouldn't have a strong relationship with intelligence, potentially stronger even than Epstein had. I would imagine that she has ties with, UK intelligence, Israeli intelligence, probably US intelligence as well. Just looking at not only, as you mentioned earlier, her, licenses to pilot a submarine and a helicopter, you also have, she has these multiple passports to different countries. She bought the house at which she was arrested with cash, using a fake name and pretending to be a journalist, and I just, I doubt that just the charges, we've talked about the kind of bogus charges against her, and looking at that alone, you can see that she's still being protected to an extent. Now, yes. I think there's an interesting potential that maybe, there are some faction that wants to see her kind of disappear, and maybe there's another faction that wants to see her protected, and maybe you're seeing that kind of conflict in the fact that she was arrested at all, but that, it's sort of still protected in the fact that those charges are not what they could be. That's
right, and that we haven't seen her,
right.
Also.
So it's almost like somebody wants to go after her to maybe silence her potentially in preemptively, and maybe somebody else, some other faction wants to protect her. That's just speculation, but it's one way of looking at what the bizarreness of the theater around it. I think that, unfortunately, when you deal with these intelligence interests, you have a lot of circumstantial evidence. You have a lot of that type of thing, but you have very little documentary proof of ties to these groups and these intelligence agencies, obviously, because that's the nature of right. that work. But I think that, Ghislaine has obviously a long, long history, not only with Epstein, but also through her father with these intelligence agencies. I would imagine she was involved in that milieu from a very, very early age. From what I know, I remember Whitney discussing the fact that Ghislaine still thinks that her father's death in 91 was a murder, and that he was murdered by intelligence. So I think Ghislaine is a very interesting figure, though, in terms of the fact that some, as Whitney says, victims recall her being at least as abusive, if not more so, than Epstein. I think she's a much more central figure than most people, especially in the media, portray her to be. I think it really would. I think that without Ghislaine and her connection to Robert Maxwell, Epstein would not have been in the position he was in.
Right.
And I think that she was not some sort of, just besotted love interest who was just in the thrall of Epstein. I think she was very much, participating in this willingly and avidly. I mean, we have stories from victims that are discussed in Filthy Rich and the investigation discovery, Who Killed Jeffrey Epstein. You have victims describing her just going out, jumping out of her car and, approaching little girls at schools and playgrounds, asking them to be models, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, while her role is discussed in the media in terms of its more lurid aspects, I think that she's kind of, how do you want to say it? I think that she's sort of infantilized almost in her role. I think that people sort of overlook the really...
more of a mastermind type
right.
of position.
The power she had. Yeah, right.
Yes.
The power that
yes.
she had in the situation, for sure.
Yes. And so she may still be in a mastermind position. I mean, it's hard to know, because it's hard to know, as you said, what kind of involvement she might right now have with intelligence, and who might want her out of the picture or who might want her protected. And without knowing where she is or what's going on, you can't tell. And I think I will talk to Whitney about the Maxwell sisters, but if you can tell us just a bit about what the other two do, or where they have been important in terms of, let's say, other interfaces with other parts of government and technology particularly.
Well, honestly, that's not an area that I've researched specifically. I've been more involved in researching the intelligence ties of Epstein and Ghislaine directly, and then other historical rings, which I'm happy to also talk about as well. That there have been so many examples of this in history that like some aspects of the Epstein case, that the public really doesn't know about, thanks to the media failing in its role. I think.
So what were you just now thinking about, just to sort of bring that in? I mean, what I was thinking of, and was probably from your interview with Whitney Webb, was that Isabel, I think it's Isabel, though it might be Christine, they have some sort of interface with the tech industry.
Right.
And so, while none of the major tech people were involved in the scandals, as far as I've heard, they come in on another side of things. And that was interesting to me. And I probably just heard it in your interview, but.
Right. And the other thing is, the other aspect of that's interesting is when you go back to Robert Maxwell and his role in not only, in this other types of trafficking, but also the technology aspect of things, the promise scandal, stuff like that, and also Iran-Contra. So the arms trafficking, aspect of Iran-Contra, the financial aspect of it, and Ari Ben-Menashe, that's kind of what he discussed a little bit in terms of that. So I think that the Maxwell family has been involved in these things for generations, essentially, and I think that is, it's worth discussing. But again, I want to take a broader view of this issue, because I think that if the public doesn't understand that these types of rings have come up but then been sort of suppressed, or the press has not done its job in really looking at them, then they kind of miss the really important takeaway from the Epstein scandal, which is this is really just a glimpse into business as usual. It's not an aberration. It's not something that, oh my goodness, how did this happen? This predator just got away with this. No, this is really something that has gone on around the world for a very long time. And, in terms of the fact that it was a ring with, older girls, I think that there are situations where much younger children have been abused as well. So, and boys, of course, there are other rings that have targeted boys specifically.
Right. Yes. I think that even, in regard to, foster children and children who are at risk, many of them have in various ways intersected with these kinds of criminal groups. Although I must say, which I know about somewhat from my work as a therapist and my work as a developmental psychologist, but I never imagined that all of that intersected with intelligence. I mean, I always thought of it as something like, a criminal activity in regard to procuring children for, sexual abuse. But I didn't think of it as a major sort of worldwide network of intelligence and blackmail. And the Maxwell family, the Iran-Contra scandal, I know about somewhat in regard to Robert Maxwell, but just if you could say just briefly, when you say generations of the Maxwell family.
Well, I'm referring specifically to Robert Maxwell and his children. Just when you have two generations like that involved, I think that's it's interesting, but it also suggests the level of entrenchment that both Ghislaine and her children and her sisters must have in some of these circles and networks.
Right. It's in some ways it's when you begin to think about the possibilities for how this kind of thing could roll along, you could see that it could be going on underneath the surface for a very long time, and that perhaps this sort of look that we're having into it through particularly Jeffrey Epstein, and it's possible, I think, that Jeffrey Epstein might have been mistaken about, just sort of how his alliances worked, and that I could sort of imagine that he felt absolutely protected when that was the wrong way to look at it, and that he may have gotten himself into a mess that allowed us to see into something that we wouldn't have otherwise seen into had he been a little bit more careful,
Yeah. I also go ahead.
No, go ahead. No.
I was going to add that I also think it's interesting that this, when he was initially arrested and, he and his death, when that is then discussed by these kind of mainstream news outlets or streaming series and whatnot, I think that in the most cynical view you could possibly have of that was that it was conveniently spun in such a way that it was very it attempted to be damaging for Donald Trump. If Donald Trump was not president, and if the media wasn't so invested in attacking him, I don't know that you would see that coverage. I really don't. And that doesn't mean, and I'm not in any way defending Donald Trump. I'm just saying
no, I hear you.
In a jaded way, I think that may be part of the reason that it was brought up in the first place, unfortunately.
Wow, that's an interesting way of thinking about it, because otherwise you think it would have just been covered up.
Yes, and that's why I think you see the focus on Alex Acosta, but the omission of Acosta's explanation for his role in the sweetheart deal. So you have,
that's right.
You have people saying basically, look at Alex Acosta, former labor secretary for Trump, basically kicked out because of controversy around Epstein. And it makes it seem as if the Trump administration is made up of these people who wanted to protect this pedophile. I think that it's a convenient line of reporting. It's a convenient narrative. And unfortunately, to see the abuse of potentially thousands of young girls used in such a jaded way simply for political gain is really an indictment of the media, honestly. It's really something you don't want to conclude, but that's the way that I look at it.
That's really an interesting angle. I hadn't thought about that at all, but even the term that you used, wedge issues, because I'm not a journalist and I don't know if that's sort of a typical trade term. What does that mean, wedge issues?
Well, I don't know that's a journalistic term. It's just basically, in my opinion, issues where, the issues that make it appear that there are differences between the Republican and Democratic Party. Issues that are not going to be, that will not ever be legislatively solved, but that appear that make conservatives or liberals, Democrats, specifically Democrats, I'm really not talking about independent progressives, but Democrats kind of feel like we've got to get our guy in to defeat the Republicans because X. And I think those issues are the ones that are championed by the media, because in reality, if you look at the issues where the Republicans and Democrats align, whether it's war, whether it's protecting people like Epstein, whatever, you come to the inevitable conclusion that the parties really are much more similar than they're different. So when I talk about wedge issues, it's really the issues that provide that cover for the duopoly, really.
Yes, and so then the Acosta case could have been brought out because of that kind of wedge issue. And otherwise, it might not have actually, because, like you say, he did say specifically that, and I think it's even in the Filthy Rich documentary.
No, it's not. That's what's so fascinating. They talk about this is what blew my mind. They discuss, they actually have film clips from the hearing in which he said that Epstein belonged to intelligence, but they don't have that part of it. They basically, they even have commentators asking the question, well, why would he do this? They don't answer.
So it's not in there.
No, but it is. It was reported by Vicky Ward in the Daily Beast that that's what the explanation he gave, and they go right up to that finish line, but they don't cross it. They go right up to it, and I think that's where I see the narrative being shaped specifically to go after Trump. They will acknowledge Bill Clinton's role, but they really want to show the footage of Trump, dancing, I think, next to Epstein at some point in the late 80s or early 90s. And again, I'm not saying that it's wrong to show that or to discuss.
But it's just the way the whole thing is presented. It's presented in a way that is simply made to be one of these wedge issues instead of looking at the reality of what has happened. And like you say, to use that with so many thousands of girls being at risk and so on, to use that as a way of illustrating something about Donald Trump just seems... well, I don't know. Unethical always seems too light a term. It seems deeply wrong, and I can't quite understand why there are not more independent media sources looking at these things. Again, it's not really hard to see that there's something wrong with the way this is being reported, but then there are so few people speaking about that that it starts to seem as though, I mean, for me personally, I got interested in it, and even talking to my colleagues or the people that I work with in putting together my own interview show, you know, they more or less said, well, why would you want to talk about that? You know, that wouldn't be something that you'd really want to pursue. And also sort of saying, well, isn't that all taken care of? And you know, and isn't that really, let's say, a horrible topic to talk about? But from my point of view, it's a much bigger issue about the truth and about journalism and about whether it's possible to actually even discern the truth through any media anymore. You know, is it possible to find out what is true, even if you do research? And I think it's very hard. I really do. You know, I think that you have to spend a lot of time going through media that are not mainstream media, and maybe some that are imbued with conspiracy theories and so on, but to find out what actually might be happening. And most people don't have the time and energy to do that. And then I think also that there is a tendency to want to let other people be the authority when it comes to the truth, you know, and that's a very deep human tendency. Some of it is, I think, probably really sort of childish or infantile, and other part of it is simply that you don't have all sorts of energy and capacity in your life. You have to focus on what you're doing, so you can't do all the work yourself. But I have always thought that journalism was supposed to be the part of our government that corrected for the lies that people in power were inevitably going to do. You know, that they were going to lie. I didn't think that our intelligence agencies were going to lie, inevitably, but apparently they do too. So I always sort of thought journalism is the corrective for that, and that corrective isn't around anymore. You know, and so it's a very scary situation in that regard. It's hard to tell what is the truth, or how to pursue the truth, or even to try to be on the side of the truth in this moment of time.
Yeah, I think that that's actually that's the why cover this story. That's the importance of it. It's not only the abuse of children and that went unreported and unprosecuted for so long. It's the fact that when you look at this story, you end up inevitably with an indictment of the media and its role, not as truth tellers and not as a check and balance on power, but as a vehicle of power, as a mouthpiece for power. You know, the basically PR firm for power. I think that basically it really exposes the actual role of the media. That's why
Yes.
That's one of the big reasons this is so important. And it's another also that's why I also parallel this story with WikiLeaks, because
Yes.
the persecution of Assange, the defamation of him, and also the attacks generally on WikiLeaks are another issue that also end at the same place, where the good journalism that WikiLeaks really did expose not only abuses of power by corporations, by governments, but the complicit role of the media in those things. Right. So I think that is a central reason that this story is important now, alongside all of the other stories that are also pressing in the media.
And so I I want to thank you, of course, for your work and for all that you've been doing. And, you know, I really particularly wanted to talk to you because I feel that your approach is thoughtful, has a larger framework around it, and can make sense of things in a way that ordinary people can understand, you know. And I wanted to ask you then, just in closing, what you think about the future of media, you know, in the US particularly, whether there, you know, are there any sort of rays of light that are hopeful, or are we just heading still into a darker period until, you know, I don't know what? How do you look at the future of media?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that it depends somewhat on how successful censorship efforts will be. you know, when you have Twitter and other social media platforms basically deplatforming people, you know, it's one thing when Alex Jones gets deplatformed, but when that same thing happens to independent journalists down the line, you know, that could really hamper their ability to get their reporting out to the public. I think that the one of the crucial reasons that there aren't more people in this kind of niche of journalism is not because people don't want to be, and not because they can't see, because I mean, like you said earlier, it's really easy to see through a lot of these lies if you just take the time to research it, even just a little bit. Right. Most people, but as you said, most people don't have the time and energy to do that. And those that do have some time and energy to do it, it's very difficult to make a living from that type of journalism, at least initially. And even when you look at, you know, Whitney Webb, Caitlin Johnstone, a lot of these figures, what they're doing is they are funded directly by their readers via Patreon and things like that, which is fantastic. And I encourage people to support independent journalists in that way. But the career path is very different to something like working for CNN or a big news outlet, where, you know, if you don't go with what your editor tells you to write, then, you know, there are hundreds of people with humanities majors who are lining up to take your place. So I think that the good news is that type of media, the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, those legacy press outlets have very little. I think that there's very little public trust with those outlets nowadays. I'm not saying there's no trust, but a lot of people really are turning away from that.
Yes.
And they are seeking out sources of news that are independent. I think basically it's a toss-up between how successful censorship will be and how much the public wants to hear independent voices. And I hope that you know, that the tide in the future will shift where independent voices become more widely heard. I don't know that will happen, and I think it really will be a battle against censorship.
I agree with you on that. I definitely agree with you, because these independent voices were coming over online media, and it's very easy to censor online media, and especially for the tech companies in our country, because we control most of the underlying structure for the whole world for that kind of media. So, you know, that's not a very hopeful picture. I mean, I think that the hopeful side of it that you pointed out is that ordinary people have become more distrustful of the mainstream media. And so if something can happen from that distrust that leads to something new, that would be the direction that things would have to go to be hopeful. But, you know, how could that happen if the censorship is going to be online? You know, I don't imagine that we're going to go back to having our newspapers delivered into our mailboxes. You know, so it's hard to say where any kind of independent journalism is going to get supported. But I'm glad it's out there for the time being, at least. And for a while, I think people thought, or people who are informed and were thinking hard about these things, that podcasts would help with it, but they can be censored too. So, you know, it's really hard to say where some kind of some sort of light can be coming, you know, out of the darkness there, or, you know, in the Leonard Cohen idea of there's a crack in everything and that's how the light gets in. I think that is the case, but sometimes it takes a long time for the light to get through the crack. And I think on this one, we may be facing a difficult time in terms of getting news out, or getting the truth, you know, into media so that people can discern what it is even. That seems to me to be the thing that we're facing. So anyway, I really appreciate your work, and I appreciate your talking to me, and you've been so good in terms of sort of pulling me through this, because it's not my usual cup of tea, and I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you. Well, I really appreciate the fact that you reached out and that you are interested in this subject. I'm really grateful that you're willing to cover it, despite maybe people kind of going, well, why would you do that? You know, and, right. And the thing is, it is an uncomfortable topic. I think that's the final word I'd say, is that I think that's a reason that a lot of people won't cover it. And
Yes.
just from an instinctual level, I think that it's very uncomfortable, and you don't want to look at those things. So thank you for doing that, and getting over that barrier of discomfort around it. And I hope that, you know, that this story does continue to be reported accurately. And the one ray of hope I do have is that people like Whitney Webb, I've seen the public interest in her reporting just skyrocket since last year. And so I think that's really hopeful. That tells me that the public does care about this issue and they do want truthful information. So I hope that they'll continue to get it from these independent journalists.